This is Matthew Kratters, Bitcoin University. Today I want to talk about grocery store price gouging. This is becoming a major issue in the U.S. 2024 presidential run-up, with Vice President Kamala Harris in a speech in Raleigh, North Carolina on Friday, saying that there's been a lot of price gouging in the grocery and food industries, and that if she's elected president, she's going to put an end to this. Now, this has been very controversial, as you can imagine. On Twitter here, we can see Tim Burchett saying Kamala's plan to put price controls on groceries shows her lack of understanding of economics. And then Dr. Jane George responding, "Are you kidding me? In 2022, Kroger reported an operating profit of over $4 billion. Walmart had an operating profit of $21 billion. Costs have increased to the consumer every year since COVID. The corporations are gouging consumers." So let's take a look at the financial statements and see if, in fact, this is borne out by the numbers. At the top here, we can see we have the income statement, we have revenues, going all the way down to net income, which is the profits to shareholders. Revenues have increased every year since 2021, going from 132, I believe this is billion because all these numbers are in thousands, so going from 132 billion roughly to the year ending in January 31st, 2024, going up to 150 billion. We can see that she is correct. Dr. Jane George is correct that in the year ending January 31st, 2023, operating profits were above $4 billion. But if we look more closely, we can see that operating income has actually been moving down since 2023, moving from $4 billion all the way down to just under $3 billion. And then if we look at net income to stockholders, it's been basically flat to down, going from $2.5 billion in 2021 to $2.2 billion in 2023, and now just a bit below that in the last 12 months to $2.1 billion. So what to make of this? We can see that Kroger's revenue is constantly moving higher every year, but their net income is stagnant, and their operating profits are actually moving lower. Now, here's an important point to remember, especially when people get very heated about politics. Just because something seems expensive to you doesn't mean that you're necessarily being cheated by a company. Anyone who's ever run their own business knows that you can be bringing in millions of dollars of revenue every year, charging customers a lot, and yet still be losing money because your company's own costs are rising at the same time. And this is why it's so important to use profit margins when analyzing a company's financials. A profit margin is just the income number divided by the revenue number. So if you want to look at gross profits, you divide gross profits divided by revenue. We're going to be looking at net profit margins, which is the bottom line, the income to shareholders, net income divided by revenue. That gives you net profit margins. In other words, this is a measure of how much of each dollar of revenue or sales that the business has gets converted to profits, because obviously businesses don't just have revenues, as a lot of politicians and some people in the electorate seem to think. They also have costs. One of the largest costs, of course, is paying their employees, and this is a good thing. Companies do create jobs. And so net profit margins is the proper metric to use to measure price gouging and industry competitiveness over a multi-year period. You have to adjust for revenues, not some subjective measure like these big evil companies are raking in billions, whereas I only make thousands. That's not really the proper measurement of these things. If you're finding this video helpful so far, I'd ask you just to help to support the channel. Click the subscribe button, leave a like, comment, suggestion for a future video. Also share this video with a friend or family member. So let's get a feel for what profit margins look like for some amazing businesses and then for some not so amazing businesses, so we can see how this varies across businesses and industries. We'll first be looking at Apple, very high return on assets, high return on equity. If we go down here, we can see net margin over the past few years. So this goes from 2014 on the left to 2023. We can see their net margins have been moving slowly higher over time. Apple's have from 21% in 2014 to about 25%, 26% over the last 12 months, so low double digit in the 20s for their net margins. Microsoft, also amazing business, very high return on assets, high return on equity. If we take a look at their net margins, they've moved up from 13% in 2014 15 all the way up to 35, 36%. And so we can see net profit margins in the 20s or 30s for both Microsoft and Apple. Now let's take a look at some grocers, some grocery store businesses to see how they compare. We'll take a look at Kroger. We can see the return on equity, return on assets is much, much lower. The only reason their return on equity is as high as it is because they're using a lot of debt. They're using a lot of leverage. Their return on assets is actually single digits, not very good. But if we look at their net margins, we can see what a huge contrast it is from Apple and Microsoft, whereas Apple and Microsoft had these net margins in the 20s and in the 30s. For Kroger, we can see they're very low single digit, 1.5%, 2.5%. And over the Biden-Harris administration, the margins have been basically flat. They've been a little bit volatile, but moving from a little over 1% in 2020 to a little bit higher, closer to 2%, and then back almost where they were when the administration started. So these are very, very low net margins. And what this means is if anything swings in their expenses piece of the business, that they will actually be losing money rather than making money, whereas Apple and Microsoft obviously have a much bigger margin there to make up for it. Walmart, better business than Kroger because they sell more than just groceries and they have this brand and this economy of scale. Their net margins anywhere from 3% in 2015. They've been going down over time. In the last 12 months, they're roughly just under 3% at 2.88%. So we can see how the grocery business has much, much lower net margins than pseudo monopolies or close monopolies like Apple and Microsoft do. Looking at these profit margins, we can conclude that no price gouging is taking place at Kroger and Walmart, which are two of the biggest grocery chains in the U.S. The low net margins are a good indicator of how extremely competitive the grocery industry is as well. Kamala, as part of her speech on Friday, said that she's going to bring back competition into the grocery business, which is absurd because it's already one of the most cutthroat and competitive businesses in the world. So what Harris is suggesting here is simply not taking place when you look at the numbers. It's really just pure political demagoguery, and it's intended to distract voters from the fact that grocery prices have gone up so much under Biden and Harris. Now, one reason for this has been out-of-control government spending, continuing the out-of-control government spending that Trump presided over as well in his 4 years. But I think the irony should not be lost on us that Kamala cast the tie-breaking vote to pass the almost $2 trillion boondoggle, the American Rescue Plan Act of 2021, which I'll link to in the description notes below. As I understand it, this was completely split in Congress, and Kamala, as the vice president, cast the deciding vote. Now, when a government runs giant deficits, spending more money than it brings in taxes, the government needs to issue a lot of debt to pay for that spending. If there's not enough free market demand for that debt, then the Fed, the central bank, needs to step in and print money to buy the debt. And it's really this money printing that's behind most of our inflation, including grocery price inflation. We've seen the top line, the revenues go up for these grocers, but the bottom line has gone up, but not as quickly. So margins have stayed very low. So if Kamala is going to blame grocery stores for price inflation of food, it would be much smarter instead to take a look at the administration's own policies. And this really goes across Republicans and Democrats, this overspending and running deficit budgets. But this is the real thing that's behind the rise in food prices. It's really the Fed and the central bankers, as well as the huge government deficits, which make it necessary for these central bankers to step in. It's very important to remember that we don't live in a magical world. You can't just cap prices and make things fair and happy for everyone. The problem is this is not how markets work. When governments impose price ceilings below the market equilibrium price, where that clearing price would be in a free market with free demand and free supply interacting with each other, when governments impose price ceilings that are below that market equilibrium price, you end up with shortages, because suppliers, sellers, grocers, businesses are not incentivized to produce or distribute goods at those artificially low prices. This really is economics 101, and it would be great if America had more politicians who understood it. Here's a good book that Marion Tuppy recommended to the VP, to Kamala, 40 Centuries of Wage and Price Controls, How Not to Fight Price Inflation. So this is really economic illiteracy, unfortunately, on Kamala's part. So what would it look like to have grocery store price controls put in place by Harris Walt's administration if they were to win. I think Robert Sterling has a great suggestion here. It's a little bit long, but I'm still going to read it because I think it's a very nice progression that he lays out. People need to stop overreacting about Kamala's plan to reduce food inflation as if it would lead to communism, mass starvation, and the end of America. I worked in M&A in the food industry. Here's a step-by-step summary of what would actually happen. The government announces that grocery retailers aren't allowed to raise prices. Grocery stores, which operate on 1% to 2% net margins, as we saw in this video, cannot survive if their suppliers raise prices. So the government announces that food producers like Kraft Heinz, which was a big investment of Warren Buffett's, ConAgra, Tyson, Hormel, also aren't allowed to raise prices. Now, not all grocery stores are created equal. Stores in lower income areas make less money than those in higher income areas, as the former disproportionately sell lower margin prepackaged foods, the center of the store, rather than higher margin fresh products like meat at the perimeters of the stores. Because stores in lower income areas are not able to cover overhead, remember, even if their wholesale costs are fixed, their labor, utilities, insurance, and other operating expenses aren't fixed yet, grocery stores start to shut them down. Because stores in lower income areas aren't able to cover overhead, grocery stores start to close those stores. Food deserts in rural areas and in low income urban areas alike become worse. Meanwhile, margins for food producers are also quickly eroding because they're not allowed to raise prices. Their primary costs, ingredients, energy, and labor, are not fixed, and their shrinking gross profits leave less cash flow available to cover overhead, maintain facilities, and reinvest in additional production capacity. Grocery stores, which have finite shelf space, start to repurpose their stores, those they didn't have to shut down, I should say, to sell more non-price controlled items. This is how markets and business owners will work. Everything from nutrition supplements to kitchenware to apparel and less price controlled food products. Your local Kroger or Safeway starts to look and feel more like a Walmart. Next step, food producers stop making products with lower margins. Grocery chains start competing with each other to secure inventory. Since they can't compete by offering stronger prices, remember, producers aren't allowed to raise prices here, and even if they could, grocery chains no longer have the gross profit to bear price increases. They compete on things like payment terms. Small grocery chains start to shut down entirely or get sold to larger chains like Kroger. In addition to not being able to cover fixed costs, a major reason for this is because they can no longer reliably secure delivery of products due to producers prioritizing sales to larger customers, which are able to leverage their stronger balance sheets to offer superior payment terms. This is a very important piece to pay attention to, and I'm not sure Kamala has thought this through. Number 8, smaller food producers, which typically sell via distributors rather than directly to grocery chains, start to go out of business. Because these producers have an additional step in their value chains, and because they have lower volumes over which to spread their fixed costs, their cost structure is inherently disadvantaged compared to major food producers. When grocery stores are not able to raise prices, cutting product costs becomes all the more important, and deprioritizing purchases from smaller producers is an easy way to do this. As supply chains break down, lines start to form outside grocery stores every morning. Cities assign police officers to patrol store parking lots, and food producers draft contingency plans to assign armed escorts to delivery trucks. The federal government announces a program to issue block grants for states to purchase and operate shuttered grocery stores. The USDA also seizes closed down production facilities. The government announces that prices for all key food costs, corn, wheat, cattle, energy, are also now fixed to stop quote-unquote profiteers from gouging the now government-operated food industry. Shockingly, the government struggles to operate one of the most complex industries on the planet. The entire food supply chain starts imploding. Communism, mass starvation, and the end of America quickly ensue. Hey, wait a second. So it really is important to think these things through rather than trying to just score cheap points in an election year. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to hit the subscribe and like buttons. Hit the notification bell if you want to be notified when I publish my next video. And let me know your questions and comments in the comment section below. Thanks all for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.